My name is Ellen, and I am the pro bono manager at NIJC, and then I'm also here with a colleague from a Heartland Alliance agency, Nicole St. Jean, who is a child psychologist, who will be giving the presentation also with me today about how to connect with clients under stress. So this is the third presentation in a series of 4. And the first 2, we talked about what is asylum and the basics of asylum law. And then the second presentation, we talked about detained asylum cases and kind of the differences with detained asylum. And today we're going to be talking more about the connecting with clients under stress, recognizing that asylum is a difficult process. And working with humans in general can be a fun task, an opportunity. And hello, welcome. No worries. Oh, we're having a few more people join us, so come on in, have a seat. You can grab something to drink, and there's some food there, yeah.
It's okay. Mm-hmm.
We have a small crew today, but we have some people online with us too, so glad you could join us.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So today we're going to be talking about how to connect with clients. We will keep this to an hour, and so we'll be done by 1 o'clock today. Let's see. Okay. The objective of today is to acknowledge the profile of NIJC clients and the complexities of working with this population group. We'll also be looking at the difference between trauma, toxic stress, and its effects on individuals, particularly in the asylum process. We'll be able to outline the ways that toxic stress will or could affect interactions with clients, which I think is why a lot of people are interested in this, to say, you know, like, how can I take this? How can I help my client give the best story? How can I help my client be the his or her best advocate and really present the case that's strongest for them? And then this will, at the end, we'll introduce a few suggestions about how to manage what could potentially be difficult or uncomfortable situations and just make them the best situation that we can. This is a very general overview, so we're not going to get into details of, you know, we're not going to do any role plays or practices or anything like that. It's just a general tips. And then we'll have some more materials to be sending out to participants at a later time. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about why we are talking about this topic and why we put this in the series of asylum law. First and foremost, I think as NIJC and the Kovler Center are parts of Heartland Alliance, we are a trauma-informed organization. And so we have a responsibility to recognize that these conversations are important and to talk about or to make safe spaces as much as for our clients as for ourselves as practitioners also. So making sure that we're aware of some of the issues that could come up in working with populations that we do. We're also talking about this because it's a responsibility. We have responsibilities when we work with other humans, when we work with other people, right? And people come from lots of different walks of life and, you know, different opinions and different perspectives. And to be able to interact with humans, to come to or to interact with other people that may be very, very different than what you're used to come to a complete product that could have a huge impact on someone's life is a big responsibility. It's also important to note, and this was something that actually Nicole had mentioned when we were preparing for this, that it's important to talk about this because as we are interacting on this humanitarian level, we also must recognize that a lot of the people that we were working with were also hurt by other people. Their persecutors were, their persecutors were humans and they've hurt them. They've lost trust in certain parts of humanity. They don't necessarily know where a secure area is or where to establish this, and they're struggling with a lot of issues. And so being able to kind of work through that framework of instability, I think takes some craft and requires some special navigating. And then mostly too, why are we talking about this is because your interactions with your clients could hugely impact how successful your case is. The way that you listen, the way that you respond, the way that you prepare, the way that you hear and interact with them can influence the way that they tell their story and the way that they are able to advocate for themselves or feel comfortable presenting their case in front of a judge, in front of an attorney, in front of a courtroom. And so it is an important element to consider when we prepare our asylum cases. And so before turning it over to Nicole about some of the what is trauma and toxic stress, I'm going to speak a little bit about who are our clients, in fact. So at NIJC, as you may have heard in other presentations, we do work with individuals and families that are at 250% below the U.S. federal poverty line. So these are immigrants, generally newly arrived, or some still, within the first years, who are establishing themselves in this country, in the city, with this language, with this system that we are in. And so they are in processes of adaptation. Also, they are individuals, like, for example, as you see here on the screen, Lula. This is just one example that I would like to kind of carry through our conversation today. So Lula, for example, and this is a common situation that we're dealing with right now, a common client profile. Lula, for example, speaks a rare language. She speaks a Mayan dialect. She's 23 years old. She's a young mother. She's seeking asylum based on years of abuse. It's physical, sexual, and emotional by an intimate partner, who is also the father of her children. She came to this country with one child, with whom the government forcibly separated them. And so she's a young mother. Her two oldest children she left behind in hiding with other family members who are also at risk. And then she brought her youngest here for the reasons that she may explain to you, but she brought her youngest here, and then she was separated from that individual, from that child, for 6 months while she and the child were also detained. So currently she's living with a family member in the suburbs of Chicago, and she does not have work authorization, or in other words, she does not have a way to support herself or her children who are back home. So again, a young mother who speaks a rare language and just has a number of processes that she's going through. And then to make sure that we're all on the same page, I wanted to review with us today what is asylum, but more, again, on the humanitarian side and not so much the legal side. Well, there is a legal side because it's a legal definition. The U.S. law mirrors international law. And these on your screen are the 5 basic elements of asylum and what we need to prove in order to show that someone merits asylum or international protection in our country. And so the first one is based on a well-founded fear. As we have heard before or can read, this is a well-founded fear of past persecution or of future persecution. So it is a fear of persecution not being defined. It's something that could be subjective and something that we also need to objectively prove in our case. But this is a fear of the past, and it's a fear of the future, which suggests that we're not living in the present. We're going through processes that are taking us out of our current state and looking at the past and the future. It is a process that looks at how others perceive us and how others want to hurt us. Or for the client, excuse me. So how the government has or will damage or cause injury, persecute the individual or themselves, or how another actor will hurt them, persecute them, and how the government is not willing or is not able to control them. So there is no structure of stability or security in their country. And all of this would happen because of a protected ground. So some innate or quality in the individual that they should not be required to change. And so a personal characteristic, they're being persecuted for a personal characteristic. So I think something important here to recognize is that this is a process that is based in fear. It is a process that looks at past and future fear. It is a traumatizing process as it exists, right? And so we talk about, well, we need to ensure that we're not re-traumatizing individuals, or we're making this the least traumatizing as possible, but at the same time, we're asking them to relive their traumas and relive some of the most difficult moments of their life. And so what our job is to recognize this and to say that we're just going to try to make this the easiest as possible, recognizing what the process actually is. So I'm going to turn it over right now, unless there's other questions. I'm going to turn it right now to Nicole, who will start talking to us a little bit more technically about trauma and stress.
Hi, thank you, Ellen, and hello, everybody. First thing, as Ellen had said at the beginning, what I'm going to be speaking about is trauma and the impact that has upon a person's experience, the way they interpret, and then also how they communicate and express their story to you as you're trying to gather information to be able to effectively plead your case. But the first thing I'm starting with this impact of core stressor slide is the different spaces of a navigation the clients are in as they meet you or show up in front of a judge. We are talking about the experience of asylum as a result of, as Ellen just outlined, their experience of persecution that is both part of their past and fear of the future, and how these individuals may be jumping between past and future. But there are also stressors that are going on in their current lives that are impacting their ability to effectively communicate with you at times. And this slide was created to organize the types of stress that our clients experience. So the experience that you're speaking with the clients about, for those who can see the screen, is on the top left. That is the trauma. These are the experiences that we know have existed in the past and that may actually still exist in the present and future. But that's typically what people think about. But with unaccompanied thinking of children, but undocumented individuals. There are a lot of other, and also refugees as well, but there are a lot of other types of experiences and stress that they encounter on a daily basis that might end up impacting their ability to talk with you about what is going on, because something else might feel more pressing to them at the time, or they might not be able to dig into their story because of these other spaces of stress. So trauma is one of them, and the way that ends up showing up is it impacts their ability to control their emotions or communicate and what might be going on. Things might be they might become too angry, they might become completely shut down, they might, as a result of trauma, not have a lot of social supports, and there might be stressors or traumas in their environment that are ongoing and continue to impact their current state. There's also, actually I'm realizing I'm probably digging a little bit too deep into this, so with regards to acculturation, this is a type of stress that families experience as they're adapting into the new country that they're in. What is it like to have left behind their routines, their rituals, their meals, their habits around education, work, religious practices? How do they communicate with family? What does that look like as you no longer have that? And now you're trying to navigate that. I'm going to the learning and language as you're trying to potentially learn another language on top of it, or you no longer have these active connections with your family members, or the communication with your family members are now across country lines or don't exist based on the types of communities that the families are in, depending on the instability in that country or community. So as the person is adjusting to their place in the U.S. or even to a detention, these are the types of worries that are consuming their time because they have nothing else to do, because they don't have access to things like healthcare or work to keep themselves busy. With regards to resettlement, if we look at the kind of four things that jump off this, what you'll end up seeing is legal is just one of these three. And so if we look at the legal component in this large concept of core stressors, it is an incredibly important one, but it is one of 12. If we look at this as how we want to organize the types of stress our clients are working in. So access to legal status, which obviously impacts healthcare, depending on the person's ability to obtain work under the table or not, and then how that ends up meeting people's basic needs. Oftentimes the clients that we see, they can't move forward with other conversations unless this resettlement core stressor is maintained at a basic level. So if people haven't eaten in 3 days, if they haven't bathed, if they don't have access to healthcare and they have some type of injury on their body, or their child has some type of tooth problem that is going on, when you're starting to ask them questions about their case, they're not going to be able to effectively communicate with you until they feel a little bit more stable around these other areas. And then the fourth stressor is isolation. This is something clients are repeatedly talking about. They left their countries not because of choice, but now they have limited connections and they are afraid to engage in the communities where they're in. If they're in detention, that's obviously one type of setting, but if they're living out in, the case of Lula, she's in the suburbs, there's a well-founded fear of what does it mean to leave my house because I might be taken? What about my two children that are with me right now? If they go to school, will I be taken during the day and they come home to an empty house and no mother? These are the ongoing stresses that end up resulting in ways that these clients may not be able to share information with you. So this is an example of the importance of the partnership between the four really different pieces of what happens when a case is going to court. The client has its own expertise in the story and the lived experience that they have. You have, as a lawyer, you have to, you're taking on their case and their story and pleading that to obviously win status for these individuals so they can live a more healthy and safe life. But the other two pieces are the medical forensic components that can establish any types of scarring, attesting to the types of experiences that they've endured, as well as the psychosocial component. And even if you are not working in partnerships with these other professional entities, these are always going to be at play for your client. So even if you don't have a medical affidavit or a psychological affidavit, those things are still part of that client's story. The mental effects of what's going on for them or the pain that they may have experienced as a result of torture or any type of experience on their journey are still being carried in their bodies as they're communicating that to you or depending on where they live. So these are always going to be at play, and this slide is just an image to show you that the law piece is one piece of the puzzle that is really needed for the clients. Are there other things?
Yeah, and I think one other thing important to notice here is that as a legal professional, as an advocate, as a lawyer, you don't have to be and you should not try to be everything. Sometimes we hear also from our pro bono attorneys that, they're trying to get them into schools and they're trying to get them access to healthcare, to driver's license, or, their husband is having issues, or, when you're working with survivors of domestic violence or any type of violence, there is type of other stresses that come with this and other types of asks that come. A lot of times our clients will come and say, I can't focus on my legal case right now because my child is sick and I need to get them to the hospital. That's fine. You are not the medical professional. You don't have to give an opinion. You don't have to necessarily, make sure that that child is medically okay, but you can also recognize that you can hand them off to another professional. So I do think that this slide also holds a space to say that, you don't have to be everything. We don't expect you to be everything. We expect you to be a legal advocate and then also know when to hand off the case.
Before transitioning to the next section, I just want to pause for any questions or comments from people that are in the room or on the phone.
I guess going to your handing it off, and that we would just contact you guys, and then you guys would then hand it off to whoever it's supposed to.
Yeah.
Or resources for that, or.
Mm-hmm. So NIJC does have a list of resources in terms of medical, in terms of social service providers. Where it comes to psychological evaluations, forensic evaluations, we do depend, the pro bono partner, whoever's responsible for the case, is responsible for setting those up for the evaluations that will turn into affidavits or support for the case. Where it's just therapy, not just therapy, excuse me, where it's accompaniment and therapy for the individual as they're moving through life and some of the stressors that Nicole mentioned, there are certain resources that we can provide you with or that you can connect the client with. Yeah.
So the next slide is a space to define trauma. And we actually put this in here because although I'm sure many of you know what this is in some way, this is a word that is thrown out quite often these days. It's very popularized, and I think people have a lot of different understandings of this. And I think there's also a way that has been colloquialized that, this trauma, I've heard this so many times, but it didn't impact this person, but it does impact another person right next to them. And so The definition I'm going to introduce is called the 3 E's, and it has to do with the 3 words that are right on this. And I'm going to describe this in a minute, but I also want to move away from the word trauma, because how trauma is understood, is expressed, and identified within the families that we work with is not universal across the globe. Trauma is experienced very differently. It is culturally bound. So individuals from one country are based on inherently where they grew up and the kinds of communities and the kinds of political environments that they were living in are not going to be the same in every space. So what existed in Tanzania is not the same in the Northern Triangle. And so when we talk about trauma, that is the broad term, but when we ask about specific experiences, clients will not necessarily know what we're talking about. They may not use the same words. They may not understand words. Words like trauma, words like domestic violence don't necessarily exist in every country. And so this is a frame to think about what is the person's perceived experience, not necessarily the way the U.S. uses language to define and kind of understand the way our country talks about these experiences. So the 3 E's has to do with an event occurred. That event can be a single incident around a hurricane, a flood or tornado, gang violence ended up coming in, community violence. It can be around specific events. It can be around, going back to Lula, she had events of emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And then she had the experience of migration and then things that might have happened to her in the U.S. But those are concrete things that have occurred. We're not saying, all we're doing is understanding what the thing that happened is. The next is the experience. So what was that person's perceived experience in that moment? Was that life-threatening? Was it scary? Was that tolerable? So for myself, I might be able to handle seeing a lot of violence in my community because that's what I grew up with starting when I was 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I might not like it, but I have a tolerance to it because that's just what I know. Versus somebody else right next to me who has never seen that before, that experience might be life-threatening to them in a different way because they grew up in a different kind of environment, a different kind of community, that they've never seen it before. And now this is something that has jarred them so rapidly and so significantly that they have not experienced this type of threat to themselves before. So this is about a person's perceived experience. The third is the effect. So what happens after the event has ended? What are the either short or long-term experiences that continue to ripple through that person's life? If, going back to me again, I am the person that grew up in an environment where community safety and violence was all over the place. I hated it. I didn't want to be around it. I did feel scared. But I can navigate it because I might have a strong family support system, or I do have a place of sanctuary in my church community. Maybe my reactions will dissipate over a period of time. But if I'm a person who either doesn't have the internal resources or external resources, or maybe it's just kind of the way things have presented in my life, that I continue to feel scared or upset or angered, or I have difficulties concentrating, paying attention, having sleep difficulties over extended periods of time, that is when it goes into the concepts of trauma. So the combination of trauma is about what event took place, what was my perceived experience of it, and how long does the impact of that last. When it lasts for longer periods of time, that is the more distressing experience, or maybe that is how I want to transition into. That is when we look at something called toxic stress. So that's also often something that people speak about in the field as well. And toxic stress has to do with the ongoing impact that the level of stress ends up having upon a person's body and how your body is actually biologically changing in response to it. Not, as we said, we're not going into the kind of ins and outs and of all the details of things, but there is neurobiological changes that happen in response to stress. It has to do with your changes in different kinds of hormones, which ends up impacting the way your brain processes information, takes it in, the way you end up responding and communicating about things. And so when this experience of trauma continues for extended periods of time, that can be described as toxic stress. So with this slide, what I first want to begin with is what happens to all of us on an everyday basis and how we take in information and essentially convert it from short-term memory to long-term memory. So for those who are at a computer and can see the image right now, this is a filing cabinet. And this is an overly simplistic way to talk about the way information is absorbed and taken in, but it is one that I use with people of all ages. So in our everyday lives, including right now we're sitting in a room listening to the two of us speak, and we are able to, through our five senses, interpret that you are relatively stable and safe and scary things are not going around you. You're able to take in information and sort other things out. For example, if you may not be listening to people's chairs that are squeaking, you may not be listening to any air conditioning that's going on in the room, because you're able to take that information in and just kind of sort out the superfluous things. This happens throughout our day. There's so much information that we're absorbing and taking in, and we don't even know it. What essentially happens at the end of the day is all of that information you're gathering into your brain and into your body, and it's being put into a filing cabinet, and it's being absorbed and kind of taken in through all of your senses. Your ear, your hearing is connected to your sight, which is connected to your body and physical space of temperature and kind of comfort with how people are around you. And it's being organized in essentially folders in a filing cabinet that when you go to sleep at night, it is your brain decides what information you want to keep in there to remember for the day, and what information you said, that's not that important. I don't remember that person walking down the street because I didn't interact with them. But at that time, your brain kind of stored that information. At the end of the day, that information that is important is put in the filing cabinet and closed, and the information that's not is essentially kind of taken out, and that's totally fine. And then overnight it is transferred into long-term memory. Does that part make sense so far? Mm-hmm. Okay. So what ends up happening, I'm going to go to this slide, excuse me. What ends up happening with trauma is the pathways in which all of that information is taken in your brain, and the way that it begins to be organized into folders is cut off. So when a trauma happens, your brain ends up interpreting information or taking in information from your senses, the same senses that allow you to take in information right now. It takes in information through your sight, through your hearing, through touch, and it sends this information to a small part of your brain called the amygdala, which is the fear center of your brain. The amygdala then tells the part of your brain that kind of essentially transfers information from the filing cabinet and from short-term memory to long-term memory. It says, stop remembering. It says, don't allow me to remember this experience. All you need to do is survive right now. All you need to do is figure out how to fight back, run away, or freeze to keep your body safe and help you survive in this moment. So talking about the case of Lula, if she is, if tracking back to her, she's 23 years old. Her oldest child is 7, which means she was 16 when she birthed her child. She has been in this relationship with the first father, which she had left. And it probably is safe to say that relationship, based on the history, was pretty volatile. So she had that child at 16. She may have been experiencing physical, sexual, and emotional abuse from him from the time that they began in a relationship together, perhaps at 14 or 15 years old. When those experiences first happened, if it was, for example, physical abuse at first, if he became violent with Lula, in those moments, her body automatically responded by trying to fight back, trying to run away or freeze from that incident happening. Her body and her mind do not want her to remember that, because all they're doing is trying to survive. Psychologically, what ends up happening during those moments is information is not put into the folders in the filing cabinet. Information is kept out of the folders because it is too overwhelming for the mind to remember. You don't want to put all those pieces together because it's hurtful. And so what we are asking them to do when we're asking for information related to the asylum case, we're saying, please put that information together and tell us your story in the greatest detail so we can win your case. Their brain doesn't want to, and it's really difficult for them. So I'm saying this not because you're coming in and saying, I need to get information, but I want you to hold this perspective when they're having trouble trying to respond to you. They might want to, but it becomes so difficult for them because their brain hasn't organized the information in a way that is coherent. And their brain, if it does put it together in a way that is coherent, feels like it is happening again. And so it is something that is challenging for them, and they are constantly navigating. If they share the story in a coherent way to you, it might feel like it's happening again, or they might feel like you inadvertently can be a type of new persecutor because you're asking them to do something painful. And that is never the intention of what you're doing, but their brain is struggling to figure out the difference. The other thing that ends up happening with this is two things. And this is not mutually exclusive, but they're just something to think about. Because the information in your brain is not put into the folder in the filing cabinet in the logical way, they're not going to be telling you the same story every time. They might be telling you bits and pieces that might not always look the same or might be inconsistent with one another. That is not them trying to be challenging or difficult. It is them truly trying to have difficulty remembering. The second piece is the person might remember every single detail, every single image, every single sound, but they might not want to tell it to you because that is what becomes the overwhelming piece. If they tell it again, that floods them, and then they might actually shut down and you might not be able to engage them further. That is not your fault. That is their brain working to protect themselves. This slide is an overview of the difficulties that can happen in response to ongoing experiences of stress and trauma. I'm not going to read through all of these, but what is important to take from this slide is that when there is chronic stress, the toxic stress that has existed for extended periods of time, it essentially impacts every aspect of your being in terms of controlling your emotions, controlling your behaviors, your ability to engage and develop relationships, how you present. You might have a lot of body aches and complaints that you might not be talking about that didn't exist elsewhere. You might not be able to focus, maintain a job, be able to complete an application. And you may not feel very good about yourself for many ways, not just because of the trauma, but how you start to present to others. And then if you present with kind of poor self-esteem and poor views about yourself, that can end up becoming self-fulfilling prophecy, especially if the environment that you're in around you is not giving you positive feedback about the space that you're in. Yep. And this next slide is something that is incredibly important to think about and hold in every conversation that you have with your clients. And this is, it doesn't just extend to clients, it truly extends to any human interaction you have, but especially when we're talking about trauma. The experience of trauma and the expressions of trauma are culturally bound. So for example, again, being somebody who grew up in the United States, and again, as a psychologist, so I have a different language, I have been educated through my academic career around how to express and understand and identify what is potentially going on inside of me, as well as how to communicate that with others. Within other countries, the same language that we use to help argue a case is not the language that they use. Words around trauma, around hurt, may not exist, may not be translatable, literally with interpreters. Words like trauma don't exist in certain countries. The other thing is experiences around being culturally bound. How I might express emotions with sadness might not look the same. They might be much more somatic. So if you are observing a client that you have, the list of experiences of persecution they've endured, but they just complain about a headache, that might be how that country's experience or how that culture's experience expresses trauma. You just need to think about, if this person's sharing something with me, you have to be curious about, could this be a sign of what has happened to them in the past? And how can you translate that into an arguable space for their asylum? There's also other types of dynamics to pay attention to, is the level of comfort a person is with disclosing trauma, thinking about what does that look like within gender roles, what does that mean with race, what does that mean with, as Ellen had said at the beginning, people have been persecuted by other humans. What potentially shared value or physical trait or gender trait do you have that might be similar to their persecutor? You're coming in to help. Did their persecutor potentially say they were going to help at some point? And you're constantly needing to navigate what this looks like as you engage with these clients.
I do think it's important, so we're now going to move into a few practical tips for working with clients in toxic stress, but I do think it's important to also comment on this in terms of culture. for anybody that has traveled abroad, for anybody that has interacted with different cultures or just interacting with different people, we can't always suppose what another is thinking, nor are we expected to, right? And so this is why, again, this is just an imperfect process that we're trying to best be aware of how to navigate in the most humane and dignified manner. And so I think a lot of what Nicole is talking about too, it is difficult, and we have to recognize that, we're not always going to be able to identify or anticipate or to navigate these issues. But again, it's just an awareness raising that we're talking about now, so that we can be a little bit more aware and have kind of a more blank slate as we come in. And so we want to finish off this presentation today talking about some basic tips about how to approach the client meetings, how to work with them. And then NIJC will have some more information geared towards pro bono attorneys and the legal community and how to interact with this type of population. So more information will be given, and then hopefully in the fall too, we'll have a more in-depth session. So the first rule always is do no harm. But of course, good intentions do not always mean good results. And so I think it's just being aware again of who we are, what we're trying to do, and who we are working with. And so on this slide here, we talk about some general tips, or we give 6 general categories to be aware of when interacting with the clients that we're working with. So looking at transparency. And transparency, I think, for people that are very ambitious, like attorneys are, and people that we want to do all that we can and with a degree of perfection, I think it's also important to recognize what we cannot do or what we will not be doing, because that's just not our role and that's not our purpose. So being able to say, I'm here to help you with your case, but I'm not going to be able to solve all the other problems. I'm not going to be able to guarantee that you're not going to be detained again. So just this transparency in establishing what we can and cannot do. Predictability. We'll get into this in a couple more slides, but managing the expectations. So allowing some sort of predictability in the interactions that we're going to have. Client autonomy, so we're going to give them, not give them, but allow them to take their choices and allow them to act on what they need and they want and have the space that they need to interact in this process. Reliability, that we are present, that we are prepared, we maintain the appointments and within the time frames that we suggest we're going to maintain them, and then support also. I know that in my experience in working with this population, one of the most important lessons I've ever learned was how to say I'm sorry, and to empathize through these words, I'm sorry. And not to say when they tell you everything, oh, I can't imagine, oh, I can only imagine what it's like. Yeah, I've had certain feelings like that too. As Nicole was saying, there's different experiences with trauma and toxic stress. And sometimes just the simple human connection of saying, I'm sorry that this happened to you. I'm sorry that this, that you experienced this, is a way to support them also and to acknowledge that their feelings are rational. And so again, through all of this, we just want to be aware of where we're at, aware of how we are approaching the situation also, and how our interactions are affecting their ability to communicate with us and to communicate their stories. So in the final 3 slides, we're wrapping up here. We basically go through 3 key components that we feel, should be the basis of all client interactions. And the first one is to establish safety. So how do we do that? We remember back to Lula, and Lula has a young daughter, or young child who's 2 years old. Lula is coming from the south suburbs of Chicago, if we're practicing in Chicago. She is coming with a minimal education. She has other children. She's not able to work. How can we make Lula feel safe in working with us? So a few suggestions that we have come across is just to recognize your body position and proximity, right? How close are you sitting? Do you have a big conference room? Are you sitting across the table from her? Are you sitting next to her? Are you going to touch her or not? Generally, we recommend not touching them until you really, really may understand this individual. And then at what point, from a handshake to a hug, to when she may be crying, like, are your hands just open on the table? There's different ways, but just recognize where your body is at and where you're sitting. Recognize who's in the room. Are you going to have 3 attorneys on the case plus an interpreter plus the lady coming in and out to bring you coffee and water with just little Lula? And so how is your space set up? Having a clock in the room can also help, I think, with a lot of anxiety and just establishing what we know goes on. A simple recommendation, right? We all have our phones and our computers that we're working on. We know how to control this space and this time. Will Lula also be able to do that? And really basic tip, is it a clock with the hands or is it a clock with just the numbers? We know that Lula has a basic education, so she might not be able to read the clock with the hands, right? So just simple things like that. Are there any other ideas in the room about how we may be able to establish safety for Lula?
I would also like to add one other thing to the clock in the room. As you had just mentioned, that we all know how to navigate our calendars and our time. The clock also helps to serve as an endpoint. Right now, Lula is saying, how many questions are you going to ask me? What's going on? How long do I have to be here? These are things that are going on in her mind. Not only would you have created an agenda and kind of shared while you're with her, but if she's starting to experience intense levels of distress and she sees that there's still an hour left, she's going to have difficulties. But if she sees there's 5 minutes left, she might be able to hold it together. So it's also using the clock to regulate how much of an intensity of conversation will that client be able to endure with you.
Yeah. And one other thing I'll just comment here, that some of our staff mentions and some of our pro bonos have mentioned to us as we've talked about the different types of stressors. So if Lula's coming from the south suburbs and she has minimal education and perhaps not experience in a city, for her to get to downtown to your office can be incredibly stressful in terms of navigating transportation, which bus to take, what happens if it's late, how is she going to talk to somebody? If she speaks mostly a Mayan language, kind of Spanish, no English, how is she going to do that? Can she get into your building? Does she have documentation to present at security to get into your building? Where is her daughter? We say, okay, we need to talk to you today, Lula, about some of the abuse that might have happened in your past. Where is that 2-year-old daughter? If that 2-year-old daughter has anxiety about being separated in the past, are you going to be able to separate them and put them in a different room so you can talk to Lula about her other abuses in the past? So being prepared in this way too, and making sure that we take into consideration those elements, I do think establishes safety. As mothers or as parents, having your child feel safe, or you thinking your child is safe, also makes you feel safe. And so there's other ways that we can think about safety for our clients.
What about pre-printed questions beforehand? I mean, like if the client's coming in, like you don't want to just get right into it, right? You gotta establish that, but sometimes that might take a long time. Like if they know ahead of time, like this is what we're going to talk about.
So something that I do when conducting is, if I was going to be writing a psychological affidavit and I have the opportunity to know I'm going to be meeting with the client multiple times, so that might be something you have available to you or not, I don't know. But during that initial conversation, it is about developing rapport. It is about, this is why we're here. I also let the client know I'm going to be asking about all of these different types of questions related to your past, to your family, to your experience of violence, experience of persecution. The types of things you might need together are different than mine, but sometimes I do have printed questions. I do have printed assessment measures that I try to get in the language that the client speaks, if that's available. And I show them in a way to establish control and trust, to say, where do you want to start? We have to get through all of these. Or can we talk a little bit about this topic, and then can we change to something else? So yes, having the opportunity to give them information ahead of time, and if you have the multiple meetings to be able to do so, I think is absolutely a way to set up yourself for success and for that client, but it's not always something you have the privilege to do. And I don't know if there's something that you would add to that.
Yeah, I think having a roadmap for your meetings, if possible, could be highly recommendable. And also, I know that I've worked with clients in the past where you say, okay, today we need to talk about this issue. And then all of a sudden, childcare falls through. The 2-year-old's here. It was a bad night. And Lula comes, or the client comes and says, I can't talk about this issue. But I think next time we were supposed to talk about another issue. Can we talk about that today instead? And so that allows also the client to kind of know like what we have to accomplish in order to get to the end product, and allows her to take control of saying, I can't do this part today. Let me do another part. But again, too, recognizing that having that conversation requires a safe space where she can advocate for herself to say, I can't do this right now. I'm going to ask to do something else. Because there is a power relationship there too, right? She's coming into my office. I'm the one asking her to do these things. So making sure that space is safe enough for her to say, can we try something else today? Yeah. But the roadmap is definitely helpful. And I think too, that also talks then to this next point about restoring power and control. So being an empowering advocate versus the rescue advocate, right? And so we're looking to empower our clients to tell their stories in a way that will convince the judge that they do need protection here. As opposed to, oh, I'm going to help you get asylum. I'm going to get asylum for you. I will do this for you. This is really a team effort. This is the client going through this again. And so control is a big piece, and I think we just touched on it with that last question, is how do we how do we facilitate the client having the autonomy to retake control of their case in their life, and to feel that this is happening to them and they're going to win this for themselves with the powers that they have. I think a lot of times too, when individuals come as asylum seekers, they've lost control of their dreams, their stability, their family structure, their culture. They've been detained. And so all of the loss of control that happens in detention, they have experienced numerous times a loss of control. And I think one of the best ways that we can be advocates is to empower them to say, this is your life. Let's tell it the best way that we can. And so we do that by establishing confidentiality, the non-judgmental stance. And I do think this is really important. I hear this a lot from our staff to say, I'm not here to judge you. Okay, we need to put everything on paper and need to know how this will happen. So you can tell me what happened. You can tell me all those little thoughts and worries. And I think, we were commenting earlier today about LGBT cases, when they first come out, and they might be concerned about how you're going to take this information. And so just to say, just tell it to me. We're going to work on this case together, and creating that safe space. Obviously, avoid multitasking. One of the things that we see most commonly is that once you kind of gain momentum in the storytelling moment of this process, a lot of times we see attorneys diligently taking notes in their computer. And this is fine and great because you don't want to miss a detail. I'll tell you though, like Nicole said with the file cabinet, sometimes that detail is going to change the next meeting anyway. And so look up, notice, is your client crying? Is your client retracted? There's different ways that you can engage and pull out different elements of the story to make sure that we do get those little details, right? And so avoiding the multitasking, providing choices, asking for permission. Can we talk about this now? Are we ready to talk about this now? I think allows the client to just engage in that way. Using simple terms. So U.S. immigration law in general, the English language is something that can be complex. So making sure that we're breaking down terms as best as possible, right? So that we can break down these power barriers. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything else to add there. If not, then we're going to get to our last slide right before time runs out. And this is called managing time. I actually think that this is the most important, and so we'll save the best for last, is managing expectations. Expectations of what is this process, expectations of what do we need to talk about and why, expectations about approximately how long do we need to see each other and what we're going to talk about in those meetings, expectations of where's the bathroom and can we take breaks, if you need food you can tell me that. So just trying to manage expectations, their expectations and your own, creates stability, it creates confidence and a safe space. it also creates respect, right? And so if we say we have to do this for an hour and the client shows up a little bit late and we try to keep it to an hour, it is the client's responsibility also to be on time as much as possible. If the client continues to show up an hour and a half late for all of your meetings, then you can have that discussion. And it is also likewise not appropriate for you to show up an hour late or to keep them waiting or to make them extend their times, because who knows what type of childcare or other issues they have going on. Working with interpreters also, we have other materials about working with interpreters and how to engage that intermediary and how much time that takes. And so just recognizing that where in some of our other work, we like things that move really quickly and fast responses and concrete responses, that won't always happen with these meetings, and that we can plan for that.
For working with interpreters, there can be many, many challenges. So this slide is not intended to do that, but I think a couple of things to know if you're working with an interpreter. If you know that the amount of time you have, the content information, cut that in half. So if you have an hour meeting, expect a half an hour to be used for the actual interpretation. So you're really only going to have about 30 minutes to get that content of the discussion that you're trying to navigate out that day. I will also say I've had interpreters that take on your role at times. They don't realize at times that they might not necessarily be interpreting the actual information. They might be translating or adjusting certain language. They might be trying to advocate for the client. They may be trying to advocate for you and trying to read your role. Make sure that you communicate you need exactly what you say to be shared with them, and vice versa. And I have also, maybe just another note, interpreters might not always be familiar with interpreting this kind of story. I've had interpreters that are having their own traumatic stress responses happen as a result of hearing the experiences that individuals that we work with have gone through. So your job is to hear the client's story, but I have seen interpreters really struggle and break down at times the story because they can't navigate it for themselves. So you need to be aware of multiple people in the room if that is the case for that individual.
So on that note, managing our own time, we're going to end it here. And I don't know if there's any questions, comments in the room or also online I'll be looking at. And if not, we thank you for joining us today. We hope you found it informative. And we will have our last summer asylum presentation on July 11th regarding LGBT asylum claims at Catton, Mitchell, and Rosenman. So thank you very much. Let me see how to shut this down. How do I do this?